It happened on a quiet evening, the kind when the city lights look softer than usual and the sidewalks still smell faintly of rain. She stood just outside the glass doors of the restaurant, one hand resting on the worn strap of her faded coat, the other holding the small hand of the boy beside her. He looked up at her as if she carried the whole world in that fragile grip. She looked inside as if she wasn't sure she still belonged there. Through the window, laughter rose from polished tables and crystal glasses. People in elegant clothes leaned toward one another under warm, golden light. When she pushed the door open, a bell chimed, small, delicate, almost apologetic, and every head turned toward the sound. Her coat brushed the floor. Her shoes had known years of walking, but the boy at her side stood proud, chin lifted, like he believed she deserved the whole room. This is Stories That Heal the Heart, where we tell quiet human stories about the moments no one sees, the ones that bruise us, the ones that save us, the ones that remind us forgiveness still walks beside us. These are stories of injustice and revelation, of truth whispered after years of silence, of the love that stays when everything else goes. If you've ever felt invisible in a place where you should have belonged, if someone once made you feel small when all you carried was dignity, then stay with me. This story might open a door you thought was closed forever. And if these stories remind you that kindness still matters, feel free to like and subscribe, so more hearts can find their way back to hope. A waiter hurried toward her, smile tight, eyes colder than the marble beneath her feet. He tried to steer her away from the dining room, one polite gesture at a time, as if her presence dimmed the room. She didn't argue. She simply held her grandson's hand, and he held her back, his fingers wrapped around hers with fierce, trembling loyalty. A small gesture, but it cut through the noise like a chord held too long on a piano. Outside, a street lamp flickered against the window, throwing patches of shadow over her coat. Inside, the lights glowed warm and steady, almost indifferent. A soft hum of silverware, the low murmur of conversations resuming. A faint trace of roasted garlic drifting through the air, a boy breathing beside her, steadying his courage, a world that had moved on without her. She lowered her gaze when the waiter whispered something under his breath, something meant to be unheard. But the boy heard it, and the way his small shoulders tightened, that was the first sign that tonight would become a memory he would carry for the rest of his life. This is a story about a woman who walked into a place she once built with her own hands, unaware that the world had forgotten her name. A story about whispers and dignity and the truth that returns when least expected. It is the story of a grandson who refused to let shame touch the woman who had carried him through every storm. And before this night ended, everyone in that room would learn who she really was. She stood there, waiting, a fragile silhouette against warm light, while the boy's hand anchored her to a kind of love that never learned to give up. Tonight we remember that, even in silence, love still answers. The dining room settled again, but not completely. There was a shift in the air, a quiet tension that moved like a draft between the tables, the kind of almost nothing that people pretend not to feel. The old woman stepped forward, slow but steady, guiding her grandson past a row of polished glasses that caught the light like tiny suns. Her coat brushed against a chair, stirring a faint scent of rain and lavender she must have worn for years. The boy looked around with wide, alert eyes, watching every expression as if trying to decide which faces were safe and which ones weren't. A couple sitting near the entrance exchanged glances, the woman lowering her voice while pretending to sip her drink. The man tried not to stare, but the curiosity pulled at him like a loose thread. Someone farther in the room chuckled softly, a sound sharp enough to break through the old woman's fragile calm. She didn't react. She only pressed the boy's hand, grounding herself in that small warmth. Her silence wasn't fear. It was habit. A learned quiet, shaped by years of being overlooked in places that once knew her footsteps. The waiter guided them toward a corner as if hiding an inconvenience. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable near the back," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The boy bristled. His hand tightened in hers. He tried to pull her toward a brighter table near the window, the one with soft golden light and fresh flowers, but the waiter stepped in front of them, blocking the path with the gentle insistence of someone who believed politeness justified cruelty. She lowered her gaze again. Her fingers trembled for a moment before settling. The boy noticed and lifted her hand to his cheek in a quiet, instinctive gesture, as if to keep the tremble from spreading to her heart. She whispered his name. Just a breath, a sound only he could hear, and he nodded. But the ache in his small chest deepened. On the far side of the room, a young hostess approached with a menu pressed tightly against her chest, eyes darting between the old coat and the scuffed shoes. She hesitated, torn between duty and the silent rules of expensive places. Before she reached them, the waiter leaned in and murmured something in her ear, something that made her expression shift into that familiar blend of apology and distance. The boy caught the whisper this time. "They don't belong up front." He felt the words land on his grandmother like dust settling on an old photograph. She didn't flinch, but her shoulders curved inward as if the weight of the room had suddenly doubled. The boy stepped in front of her, small but fierce, placing himself between her and the world that refused to see her. A silver spoon clattered somewhere in the kitchen, followed by a brief hush. The sound echoed strangely inside his chest, like the start of something breaking. The lights above their table flickered once, not enough for concern, just enough to make the shadows stretch long across the floor. From the booth near the wall, an elderly man watched with quiet, troubled eyes. He had been eating soup alone, his spoon resting mid-air as he followed the scene with a heaviness that couldn't be disguised. A small petala of life unfolded there. He lifted his napkin, wiping broth from his trembling hand, and whispered to no one, "She reminds me of someone." He didn't interfere, not yet. But the knowing sadness in his gaze carried a story of its own. The hostess finally approached, forcing a polite smile. We may not have the reservation you mentioned," she said carefully. The boy opened his mouth to protest, but the old woman gently touched his shoulder, a quiet request for patience. She reached into the pocket of her coat and withdrew an envelope folded with meticulous care. The paper was softened by age, edges slightly frayed, as if it had been opened and closed too many times. The envelope carried the faint scent of cedar and thyme. A name was written on it in graceful, steady handwriting, her handwriting, though no one in the room knew that yet. The hostess glanced at the envelope but didn't open it. Instead, she placed it on the podium with the kind of delicate caution people reserve for things they don't quite understand. She promised to check with the manager, then vanished into the back hallway, her footsteps quick, almost nervous. Left standing, the old woman touched the back of a chair for support. She wasn't frail exactly, but the years had softened her stance, and the cool air of the restaurant made her bones ache. The boy reached out to steady her before anyone else noticed. He tried to smile at her, but the corners of his mouth faltered under the pressure of humiliation he couldn't yet name. The lights above them hummed softly, a gentle buzz that blended with the murmur of the room. The old woman's gaze drifted toward a framed photograph on the far wall, a picture of the restaurant in its early days, a younger staff, a different decor, a modest crowd. But the boy didn't see the recognition flicker in her eyes. He didn't know that her hands had once helped carry bricks for that very foundation, had polished tables like these, had cooked meals in a back kitchen that smelled of garlic and hope. A waiter walked past carrying a tray of wine, the glasses swaying gently as he moved. One guest commented on how the ambiance was ruined tonight, just loud enough for the boy to hear. He turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. His grandmother didn't meet his gaze, but the soft tremor of her fingers against his palm told him everything. Near the bar, a bartender polishing a glass paused for a moment. Another pitala unfurled. He noticed the boy's tense expression and, without drawing attention, slid a glass of water toward the edge of the counter, leaving it there as if by accident, a quiet offering for later. A manager emerged from the back hallway, flipping through the reservation ledger with the impatient confidence of someone who rarely questioned his own authority. His steps were brisk, shoes tapping sharply against the floor. The boy watched him approach, shoulders straightening, as if bracing for another wave of dismissal. The manager didn't look up at first. He scanned the page, frowned, scanned again. The envelope lay beside the ledger, untouched. When he finally lifted it, the old woman's name caught the light. A flicker crossed his face. Confusion at first, then disbelief, then something like regret that he didn't yet know how to carry. But he said nothing. Not yet. His silence left the room suspended in a fragile sort of stillness, like a breath held too long. The boy pulled gently at his grandmother's coat. "Are you okay?" he whispered, the words barely forming. She smiled at him, a small, tired smile, and smoothed his hair with the tenderness of someone who had learned to make love louder than shame. Across the room, a young woman feeding her baby paused when she saw them. Her eyes followed the old woman's trembling hand, the boy's brave posture, the waiter's cold stance. Without thinking, she wrapped her baby a little tighter, as if shielding something sacred from the same fate. The manager closed the ledger. He placed one hand on the envelope and looked directly at the old woman for the first time since she entered. Something in his gaze softened. But the rest of the room didn't know that moment yet. All they saw was an old woman waiting too long, standing too still, holding on to the only hand in the room that loved her. Outside, the street lamp flickered again. Shadows moved slowly across the window. Inside, the old woman remained where she was, rooted in a dignity the world had tried to erase. The boy leaned against her, as if trying to make himself bigger, braver, enough to shield her from everything. He didn't know what was coming. He only knew that she deserved better than whispers and sideways glances. He didn't know how much this place still owed her. The boy stood close to her as the room settled into a low murmur again, but the old woman didn't move from her spot. Something in her eyes wandered far beyond the golden chandeliers and polished cutlery, drifting into a place only she could see. The boy tugged softly at her sleeve, trying to draw her back, but her gaze had already slipped through the thin fabric of the present and into an older world. One he had only heard about in pieces, in stories she told when the house was quiet and the kettle whistled on the stove. She remembered mornings that smelled of fresh dough and warm sugar, a small kitchen, far simpler than this one, where her apron bore the stains of a life spent feeding people who weren't strangers to hunger. She remembered standing by a window that overlooked a street lined with dusty roads and tired faces. She remembered serving soup to men who had forgotten the taste of kindness. She remembered laughter rising from worn-out chairs and cracked plates, laughter that sounded richer than anything echoing through this expensive room tonight. A soft tremor crossed her hand as those memories brushed against the moment. The boy noticed it and stepped closer, pressing his cheek lightly to her arm. The gesture pulled her back enough for her to see him. his round face lifted toward hers, eyes wide and steady, as if he were guarding not just her dignity but her entire history. Her memories didn't fade, though. They deepened, weaving themselves between the texture of the tablecloths and the shine of the silverware around her. She remembered the years when this place was nothing more than a dream scribbled on the corner of a grocery list, a simple idea, a warm meal for anyone who needed it. No uniforms, no chandeliers, no reservations, just food, generosity, and honest work. Her fingers tightened around the boy's hand as she remembered the man who used to stand beside her at the stove, her husband, tall, tired, always humming that same old tune under his breath. He said, "One day, we'll build something that feeds more than stomachs." She used to laugh at him for dreaming too big, but he believed in people the way most believed in miracles. And somewhere along the line, she began to believe too. The boy traced a circle on the back of her hand with his thumb, a nervous habit he did when he sensed sadness. She swallowed gently, comforting him more than herself. She wasn't sad, not exactly. It was something else, something closer to longing, or the ache of remembering a dream fulfilled and forgotten by everyone but her. The lights flickered again, subtle but enough to catch her eye. The sound of clinking glasses swelled and softened, like waves pulling back from the shore. The loop of sound wrapped itself around a fragment of memory. The same sound she used to hear when the restaurant hosted its first customers decades ago. Back then, the room was filled with faces she knew, people she had helped, people who had helped her, people who never laughed at her shoes or coat. A waitress passed by carrying a tray of dishes. One plate trembled slightly as she set it down, and the old woman caught sight of a chipped corner, a tiny imperfection on otherwise flawless porcelain. She blinked. Once, all her dishes had been chipped, not because they were neglected, but because they were used, loved, passed from hand to hand, carrying stories of survival. Here, even imperfection looked expensive. A man at the nearest table shifted uncomfortably when he saw the old woman linger, though she wasn't looking at him. He cleared his throat, turning his menu like a shield. The boy watched him, confusion tightening the corners of his eyes. "Why do they look at you like that?" he whispered, careful to keep his voice small. She brushed his cheek with her knuckles. "People forget," she murmured. "Sometimes they forget who built the things they enjoy." The boy frowned, not understanding fully but feeling the weight behind the words. He leaned closer, placing his hand over hers where it rested on the chair. She had forgotten how warm his hands always were. Warm, like ovens in winter. Warm, like hope. The room shifted again as the manager reappeared with the envelope still in hand. But he didn't approach immediately. Instead, he paused behind the podium, eyes tracing the old woman's outline as if trying to reconcile two versions of someone, the one in front of him, and the one whose name he recognized from stories he'd heard whispered by the older kitchen staff. The boy didn't see him. He was watching his grandmother look toward the framed photograph again. "Who are those people?" he asked. She hesitated. It wasn't the people in the picture that held her attention. It was the old wooden sign hanging above the door in that photograph. The original name of the restaurant. A name she had painted by hand on a piece of scrap wood, balancing on a ladder her husband steadied from below. Her letters weren't perfectly straight, and the paint had dripped on the edges, but in that picture, the sign looked proud, brave even. Her breath trembled. The boy caught it. "Grandma?" She reached into her coat pocket again, touching something left there. A napkin folded long ago, soft from being opened and closed too many times. A simple napkin with faded printed flowers, the last memento from the kitchen she once worked in. It was her object symbolo, though she didn't know the word for it. She only knew that it still carried the scent of flower and rosemary if she held it close enough. She didn't take it out. Not yet. "You see that sign?" she asked him quietly. He nodded. "I painted it," she said. He blinked. "You did?" Her eyes softened. "Before any of these tables were here, before the lights, before the chandeliers, before this became..." She looked around. Whatever it is now." The boy's jaw tightened in confusion. "Then why don't they know you?" She smiled, a small, aching smile. "Time has a way of sweeping names away if no one bothers to remember them." A server walking past heard a fragment of that sentence and paused, the edge of empathy tugging at her expression. She didn't interrupt. She only lingered for a moment, holding a tray close to her chest, thinking of her own grandmother working double shifts her whole life without praise. A petala of humanity bloomed quietly there. She reached the old woman's table by mistake, offering 2 glasses of warm water and saying softly, "For you and your grandson. It's a bit chilly tonight." Her voice wavered slightly, as though she wasn't just speaking to a stranger. The old woman blinked, touched by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she whispered. The server nodded once, then turned away before anyone noticed her bending the rules. The boy lifted his glass immediately and placed it gently in his grandmother's hands. "Here," he said, eager to help. She wrapped her fingers around it slowly, letting the warmth seep through her palms. The manager approached at last. He walked slowly, almost cautiously, as if aware that each step carried the weight of something long overdue. He didn't look at the boy this time. He looked at her. Really looked. And in his eyes, something shifted again. Recognition wasn't a sudden burst, it was a gentle thaw, like morning light breaking through frost. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught. He closed the ledger under his arm. The room hummed with soft conversation, but he heard none of it. His gaze drifted toward the framed photograph as if confirming a truth he had always meant to learn, but never did. "Ma'am," he began. But before he could say more, her eyes drifted back to another memory. The day she had closed the doors of the original restaurant after her husband passed, leaving the key in the hands of a young investor who promised to keep the spirit alive. She had believed him because she wanted to believe in the goodness of people, and perhaps for a time he had kept that promise. But promises fade when profit speaks louder than legacy. The boy squeezed her hand again. "Is everything okay?" She looked down at him, and her heart softened in that way only grandmothers know, that way only years of sacrifice can teach. "Everything will be," she whispered. "Some truths take time." He leaned his head against her arm again, trusting her completely. The manager inhaled deeply, steadying himself. And though the room still buzzed with soft judgment, the truth had already begun to shift inside him. A change too quiet for anyone else to notice, but big enough to turn the entire night toward a different ending. The boy didn't know it yet, but he had just witnessed the first crack in the wall that had tried to shut her out. The night was still heavy with whispers and shadows, but something new had begun to rise. Something warm, familiar, and long overdue. The manager held the envelope between his fingers as though it might crumble if he gripped it too tightly. His lips parted once, then closed again, the words backing away before they could cross his tongue. Behind him, the soft murmur of cutlery and conversation filled the room like a practice soundtrack. Nothing in that polished world made space for pauses like this. He cleared his throat, smoothing his tie with his free hand. "We're very busy tonight," he said finally, his voice steady but strangely distant. "I'm not sure we can accommodate—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the boy heard enough. The boy always heard enough. His heart crawled into his throat. "But we have a reservation," the boy replied, his voice softer than he wanted it to be. "My grandma called. She wrote it down." He pointed at the envelope. "It's right there." A few nearby tables turned subtly in their chairs, pretending to look away while leaning closer in. Someone smirked. Another guest raised a brow, taking in the old coat, the familiar scuffs on her shoes. The manager opened the envelope at last. A single page rested inside, its edges worn from being folded and unfolded countless times. At the top was a name written in strong, careful handwriting. He read it once and felt his grip falter. He read it again, and the room around him seemed to slip a little out of focus. He knew that name. He had heard it murmured in the kitchen late at night when the last table had left. The older cook told stories sometimes about how the restaurant used to be. Before the renovations, before the investors, before the glossy wide windows and the black and gold menus. He spoke of a woman with flour on her arms and fire in her eyes, a woman who fed anyone who walked through the door, whether or not they could pay. The manager had always nodded politely and let the words drift past him like smoke. Old stories, old owners, old debts. Now the name stared back at him from the paper. The same name as the one on the framed certificate hanging in his office. The same name etched small and discreet at the bottom of a plaque in the hallway almost no one bothered to read. He swallowed, feeling his composure slip. Then he looked up and saw the eyes on him. Staff watching, guests watching, the boy watching, all waiting for him to decide what this meant. He closed the envelope quietly and placed it on the podium. "Of course," he said, forcing the professional tone back into his voice. "We will take care of you. Take one moment, please." It was a thin bridge between two worlds that did not yet touch. He gestured to the waiter who had first intercepted them. "Prepare a table," he said. The waiter hesitated just enough for the boy to notice. "In the back?" the waiter asked, lips barely moving. A pause. The manager's jaw tightened. "Yes," he said. "For now." For now. The words slipped like a stone into the boy's stomach. He didn't understand the weight of what the manager had discovered, didn't know his grandmother's name had just shaken something loose behind the scenes. All he saw was a decision, and all he felt was the familiar sting of being pushed aside. The waiter led them past tables dressed in linen white, past plates decorated like paintings, past conversations that lowered in volume whenever they drew near. The boy could feel the heat of glances on the back of his neck. It made him taller and smaller at the same time. They were seated beside a service door, near the faint clang of dishes and the breath of the kitchen's heat escaping in short bursts. The table was clean, but the light above it flickered a little. A soft buzzing hum filled the space, a different music entirely from the soft piano drifting through the rest of the dining room. The old woman slipped into her chair with a slow exhale. The boy pulled out the other chair for her, careful not to scrape it too loudly on the floor. He had watched people do that in movies. He wanted her to feel like she belonged in those scenes too. Their menus arrived quickly, dropped on the table with a little more force than necessary. The waiter didn't bother with the usual introduction. No good evening. No mention of specials. Just a nod and a sigh that stayed in his eyes even when his mouth remained neutral. The boy glanced from the glossy pages up to his grandmother. "Are you okay sitting here?" he asked. Her gaze drifted over the restaurant, lingering on the far window where the reflection of the city lights shimmered. "I've sat by doors my whole life," she replied softly. "I've never minded them." But the boy minded. He minded every quiet dismissal she pretended not to feel. Across the room, a woman in a silk dress whispered something into her partner's ear, eyes flicking toward the corner where they sat. Her lips curled, not quite into a smile. The man chuckled under his breath and shook his head, as if dismissing the thought but enjoying the taste of it. Closer to the bar, a group of young professionals glanced at the corner table and exchanged silent assessments. One of them laughed, then caught sight of the server's glare and swallowed the sound, turning it into a cough. Near the kitchen entrance, the older cook wiped his hands on a towel, watching the old woman from a distance. There was a crease in his brow, a faint frown that deepened with each passing second. He couldn't place her yet, not fully. But something about the way she sat, the way she looked around as if reading the history of the walls, felt hauntingly familiar. A glass slipped from a busboy's hand and hit the edge of a tray, cracking neatly in two. It was a small, clean break, but the sound cut through the room like a shout. The manager flinched. The boy turned his head. The old woman didn't move. Her fingers had found their way again to the inside pocket of her coat, pressing softly against the folded napkin like a prayer pressed between pages of an old book. The waiter returned to their table. "Are we ready to order?" he asked, his tone stiff, a little impatient. The boy studied the menu, tracing the words with his eyes. The prices blurred. "Grandma, what do you want?" he asked. She looked at the menu, but her mind was elsewhere. Once upon a time, the offerings here had been simple: stew, bread, coffee, soup. Meals that warmed the bones and loosened the knot in a tired chest. Now the dishes had names that felt foreign on her tongue. "Something warm," she said quietly. "Whatever you have that's warm." The waiter sighed softly. "We have many warm dishes," he replied. "If you're unsure, I can recommend something. Our chef's tasting menu, perhaps, though it is..." His voice trailed off as his eyes flicked down, measuring them without meaning to hide it. The boy felt heat rise in his face. "We're not asking for anything free," he said, his voice shaking. "My grandma saved for this. I did too. We wanted to eat here, like everyone else." A nearby fork paused mid-air. Someone muttered, "Relax, kid," under their breath. The waiter glanced nervously toward the manager's station, where the manager was now on the phone. His hand pressed flat on the reservation book as if trying to keep something from slipping away. "I didn't say you wanted anything free," the waiter replied, but the defensiveness gave him away. "I just need to know what you're ordering." The old woman reached into her bag and pulled out a small cloth coin purse. Its fabric was faded, the zipper a little crooked from years of being opened and closed. She placed it gently on the table, her fingers smoothing the worn edges. "We will pay," she said, her voice soft but steady, like everyone else. The boy watched her, pride swelling and breaking all at once. He knew how long it had taken to fill that purse, little by little, week after week. Coins dropped in after the grocery shopping was paid, after the electric bill, after the rent. Sometimes from his own small hands, slipping in a few saved bills from odd jobs and birthday gifts. The purse looked too small against the wide tablecloth. The waiter stared at it for a heartbeat too long. Then, with an awkward nod, he scribbled something on his pad. "I'll bring you our house soup and bread to start," he said. "It's warm." He walked away quickly, but the damage lingered in the space he left behind. The boy's gaze followed him. "He thinks we don't belong here," he whispered. His grandmother turned toward him with a tenderness that softened all the sharp corners of the moment. "We belong wherever our feet are standing," she said. "Don't forget that. Not for anyone." He tried to hold on to her words like you hold on to the rail of a steep staircase, but the stairs felt very high tonight. A family at a nearby table watched them. The youngest daughter, no older than the boy, stared openly until her mother gently tugged her sleeve. "Don't stare," she murmured. The girl, curious and unashamed, whispered back, "Why is that lady's coat so old if this place is so fancy?" The mother didn't answer. She looked away instead, her silence a mirror of all the conversations that went unspoken in rooms like this. In the kitchen, the older cook stepped closer to the swinging door, peeking through the small round window. He studied the old woman's profile, the line of her jaw, the way her shoulders sat, the shape of her hands wrapped around the water glass. His eyes widened just enough to betray that a door in his memory had creaked open. He disappeared for a moment, rummaging through a drawer near the back wall. He pulled out an old laminated card, edges curling, the ink faded but still legible. At the top, a black and white photograph showed a younger version of the restaurant. Standing by the door, apron tied tight, was a woman with the same eyes as the one in the corner now, only brighter, less weighed down by years. Beneath the picture, a line of text read, "In honor of the founder, whose hands built this place from scratch." He stared at the photograph, then at the door, then at his own reflection in a metal tray as if asking it what he was supposed to do. Back at the table, the boy watched his grandmother study the room. Her eyes moved slowly over every corner. The bar, the lights, the photos on the walls, the way the staff moved like choreographed shadows. It was all foreign and familiar at the same time. "Does it feel strange?" he asked. She took a breath that reached deep into her chest. "It feels like walking into a house you once lived in," she said. "Only now, no one knows you had a key." The soup arrived in a deep white bowl, steam rising in gentle spirals. The bread came warm, its crust crackling softly when she broke it. She tore off a piece and placed it on the boy's plate before serving herself. Her movements practiced, instinctual. Feeding others first was a habit she had never unlearned. He tasted the soup and let out a small sigh. "It's good," he said. "Really good." She took a spoonful and closed her eyes for a moment. Garlic, rosemary. A hint of something familiar beneath the polished presentation. Her recipe had started with onions and bone broth, nothing fancy, cooked slowly until the kitchen smelled like you could rest in it. Things had changed, but the foundation tasted the same. Across the room, the same man who had complained earlier leaned toward his partner. "You'd think places like this would have a dress code," he muttered, not bothering to keep his voice as low as before. "You pay this much. You don't want to feel like you're eating at a charity event." The boy heard. The words landed like stones in his chest, one after another. His eyes burned. He put his spoon down carefully, afraid his hand might shake. He turned toward his grandmother, ready to say they could leave, that they didn't need this place to make a memory, but she was looking down at her soup, stirring it slowly, as if trying to make sense of the past, swirling with the present in one small bowl. He reached for her hand under the table. She gave it to him without hesitation, their fingers intertwining in a grip stronger than either of them realized. The humiliation didn't come in one big moment. It came in fragments, a laugh here, a stare there, a whisper, a sigh, a look that slid past them as if they were in the way. The manager watched from a distance, torn between the image of her in the old photograph and the reality of her sitting by the door. His own reflection in the glass looked back at him, younger, polished, unsure. His career had been built on efficiency, presentation, keeping guests happy, keeping investors happier. He had never been asked to carry history as well. The older cook stepped out from the kitchen at last, wiping his hands on his apron. He approached the manager slowly, the laminated card clutched in his fist. When he reached him, he held it up without a word. The manager looked at the photograph, then at the woman, then back again. "That's her?" the cook said quietly. "Or I don't know anything about faces." The manager's breath caught. There it was. Confirmation. The founder. The woman from the stories. The hands that had once stirred the first pots, scrubbed the first floors, fed the first neighbors. And she was sitting by the service door. The shame that washed over him wasn't dramatic or loud. It was a slow, deep sinking inside his ribs, the kind that makes it hard to look at yourself without flinching. He hadn't humiliated her with words, but he had allowed it. He had stood by while others did. He had given the quiet nod that said, "Put her in the back." He looked at the boy again. The small, determined hand wrapped around hers, the way he sat up straighter every time someone looked in their direction. The manager closed his eyes briefly, as though bracing for an impact he knew he deserved. In the corner, the old woman broke another piece of bread and placed it gently into the boy's hand. Her voice was barely more than a whisper when she spoke. "Eat," she said. "We came for this, not for them." But even as she said it, the humiliation sat in the air like smoke, thick, lingering. It clung to their coats and hair and the corners of their eyes. The boy chewed slowly, each bite harder to swallow than the last. He felt small and angry and proud and lost all at once. He wondered what it meant that the place she had helped build could treat her like this. He wondered what it meant that they could sit in a room that had her fingerprints on its walls and still be asked to stay near the door. He wondered if anyone here would ever understand who she really was. As he lifted his spoon again, his hand shook just enough to make a drop of soup fall back into the bowl. The small ripple seemed to echo the tremor running through him. It was the lowest point of the night, not because of one cruel remark or one dramatic gesture, but because the sum of all the small humiliations had finally pressed down hard enough to make his young heart believe for a moment that the world was unkind by design. And yet, even there, sitting in the corner of a restaurant she once dreamed into existence, the old woman straightened her back, lifted her spoon, and took another slow, deliberate sip. She had weathered harder winters than this, but the boy couldn't know that yet. All he knew was that something precious was being mishandled in front of him. All he knew was that the room had yet to see what he saw every day. The strength wrapped inside the old coat, the courage inside the worn shoes, the history in the hands that held his. Outside, the rain began again, tapping softly against the window. Inside, the manager finally stepped away from his station and started walking toward their table, the laminated photograph still in his hand. The night had reached its darkest point. It was almost time for the light to move. The manager walked slowly toward their table, each step deliberate, as if the ground beneath him had shifted in ways he wasn't prepared to explain. The laminated photograph trembled slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from the weight of a truth he had allowed himself to forget. The closer he came, the more the room seemed to alter its breath. Conversation softened. A few guests looked up, sensing a change without understanding it. The boy noticed him first. His shoulders tensed, and he slid his chair a little closer to his grandmother, as though ready to shield her with his own small frame. She rested a gentle hand on his leg, steadying him. Her gaze, however, remained lowered toward her soup, not defeated, simply patient, as if she had seen far worse storms than the quiet hostility of a dining room. When the manager reached the table, he paused. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He simply looked at her, looked and truly saw. The lines around her eyes carved by years of work, the softness in her expression, the calm dignity of a woman who had carried more than any of them would ever know. Her coat, worn at the seams. Her hands, weathered but steady. Her posture, small yet unbroken. "Ma'am," he finally said, voice low enough that only they could hear, "I believe there's been a mistake." The boy's chin lifted sharply. He didn't trust the tone. He didn't trust the moment. His grandmother placed her spoon down with deliberate care and looked up for the first time since he approached. Their eyes met. Hers, tired but open. His hesitant and conflicted. The manager placed the laminated photograph on the table, turning it toward her. The picture showed the old storefront, humble and hopeful, with a younger version of her smiling shyly at the camera. The boy leaned in, his breath catching. "That's you," he whispered, equal parts shock and pride. The old woman didn't answer right away. Her fingers reached out, resting lightly on the corner of the photograph as if touching an old memory through a thin sheet of glass. Her eyes softened, not with sorrow, but with recognition. A quiet greeting to a younger self who still lived somewhere inside her. The manager cleared his throat. "I'm deeply sorry for how you've been treated this evening. If I had recognized you sooner..." "You didn't," she said gently, saving him from the rest of the sentence. "That's enough." The simplicity of her words hit him harder than blame could have. The boy looked between them, his heart beat thundering with a mix of relief and outrage. "Grandma, why didn't you tell them?" he asked, voice tight. "Why didn't you say who you were?" Her hand slid onto his, warm and steady. "My love," she murmured. "A person shouldn't have to announce their worth for others to treat them with dignity." The boy swallowed hard. He felt those words settle deep inside him. A lesson wrapped in kindness and sorrow. The manager lowered his head, shame rising through his chest in a quiet, steady tide. He wasn't sure how to stand in this moment. He wasn't sure how to repair it. He only knew he had to try. "If you'll allow me," he said softly, "I would like to move you to our best table, and I'd like to personally serve your meal this evening." He hesitated. "It would be an honor." The old woman smiled, a small, tired smile that held no triumph. "We are comfortable here," she replied. "But this isn't..." he began. She raised a gentle hand, stopping him with kindness rather than authority. "This seat is no less worthy than any other. If you wish to make things right, you may. But I don't need a grand gesture. Respect is enough." The boy's chest swelled with a fierce love so strong it almost hurt. She was being gracious to a man who did not deserve it yet. She was choosing dignity over vindication she always had. The manager nodded slowly. "Then allow me to at least correct our mistake." He turned to the waiter who had been watching from afar, discomfort creeping up his spine. "Clear table 6, he instructed quietly, "and bring out the founder's meal." The waiter blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. "Sir, we don't serve that anymore." "We do tonight," the manager replied. The waiter hesitated, then hurried toward the kitchen, murmuring orders as he went. The boy tugged softly on his grandmother's sleeve. "What's the founder's meal?" She smiled faintly. "It's nothing fancy. Just a stew your grandfather and I used to make. We served it to anyone who needed a warm plate. No one left hungry. That was the whole rule." He nodded as if this explained everything in the world. The manager took one more breath, gathering courage. "If it's all right with you," he said, "I'd like to share something. My grandmother. She came here once, many years ago. She said a woman in the kitchen gave her food even though she couldn't pay. She said she never forgot the kindness." His voice wavered. I think that woman was you." The old woman lowered her gaze, not out of shyness, but out of humility. "Many people came through those doors," she replied. "We helped who we could." He nodded, swallowing. "You helped her, and she never stopped talking about it. I grew up on her stories. I didn't know they would bring me to you." A silence settled between them, the kind that heals instead of harms. The boy squeezed her arm tightly, his heart swelling with a pride so big it almost felt too large for his chest. To him, she had always been extraordinary. But now, in this room full of strangers, her goodness had found its way back to the surface. The manager bowed his head, a gesture not of formality, but of gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything you built here." He walked away slowly, carrying the photograph back to the podium as though it were something sacred. The restaurant was not the same after that. Not in a dramatic way, nothing loud or sudden, but there was a shift, a softening, a ripple of awareness that moved from table to table like a warm current. The woman in the silk dress lowered her eyes, shame flickering across her features. The man who had mocked them earlier cleared his throat and stared down at his plate, his appetite shrinking. The young mother with the baby pressed a kiss to her child's forehead, her gaze softening as she looked toward the corner. The older cook stepped out again, carrying a small bowl he had prepared himself. He placed it in front of the boy. "Extra bread," he murmured, "on the house." The boy thanked him quietly, but his eyes kept drifting back to his grandmother, to the way she sat now. Not taller, not prouder, but exactly the same as before. She didn't need validation to become more. She had been enough all along. The lights above their table steadied, the flicker gone. The hum softened into a gentle, even glow. Something was changing, something long overdue. But the night wasn't finished yet. The truth had been recognized. Respect had begun to take its rightful place. But the moment of revelation, the moment when the entire room would see who she truly was still waiting. And it was coming soon. The older cook hurried back into the kitchen, his steps quicker now, energized by a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He reached for a pot tucked away on a high shelf, an old copper pot, darker than the others, its bottom worn thin from decades of use. It had belonged to the original kitchen, the one before renovations, before stainless steel replaced memory. He placed it gently on the stove, almost reverently, and began gathering ingredients with hands that suddenly remembered their old rhythm. Outside in the dining room, the boy watched the door swing open and closed, catching glimpses of movement inside the kitchen. He couldn't see what was happening, but he could feel the shift in the air. Something was stirring, like a truth fighting its way to the surface. His grandmother sat quietly, her hands folded over the coin purse, her gaze soft but far. She seemed smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller for the weight she carried alone for so long, larger for the dignity she refused to let go of. Her eyes drifted once more to the framed photograph of the original restaurant on the wall. It was like watching someone look into a window that showed not the past, but a life paused mid-breath. The door to the kitchen swung open again. The older cook emerged with the copper pot in one hand and a ladle in the other. He walked with steady, purposeful steps, ignoring every pair of eyes that followed him. The smell reached the table before he did. Warm, earthy, filled with garlic and rosemary and something deeper, something like a heartbeat made into food. The boy's eyes widened. "That smells like your soup," he whispered. The old woman inhaled softly. Her shoulders softened. "It is my soup," she murmured. The cook arrived at their table, setting the pot gently atop a folded towel. He didn't speak at first. He simply placed 2 bowls in front of them and began to serve, ladling the stew with a slowness that felt ceremonial. "I've heard about it for years," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd get to make it in front of the woman who invented it." The old woman blinked, startled. "I didn't invent anything," she said quietly. "I just cooked with what we had." The cook shook his head. "Maybe, but you fed a whole neighborhood with those hands. People still talk about it." A softness moved across her features, like a curtain slowly opening. Not pride, something gentler, harder to name, something like being remembered. When he finished serving, the cook stepped back but didn't leave. He stood there as if waiting for permission to stay. The boy dipped his spoon into the stew first, blowing on it gently. He tasted it, and his eyes lit up. "Grandma," he whispered, "this tastes like home." She lifted her own spoon, hands trembling just enough for the boy to notice. The moment the soup touched her lips, something inside her shifted, an emotion too delicate and too old to be loud. Her eyes glistened, not with tears but with recognition, a returning of something long lost. Across the restaurant, the manager stood near the bar, watching with a heavy, thoughtful silence. He turned to the hostess. "Bring them a candle," he said softly. "Something warm." The hostess nodded and hurried off. At the couple's table near the entrance, the woman in the silk dress lowered her fork and whispered, "Do you think that's the founder?" Her partner frowned at the question, then followed her gaze. It was the first time all evening he didn't look at the old woman with judgment. Instead, his expression shifted, confused, unsettled, and something else beneath it. A slow ripple passed through the room. Conversations faltered. Chairs shifted. Something unseen loosened inside the collective air, as though the walls themselves remembered her footsteps. When the hostess returned, she set a small white candle between the old woman and the boy. "For warmth," she said gently, "and for light." The old woman nodded once in thanks. The flame flickered softly, its glow reflecting in the polished silverware like a quiet blessing. The boy watched the flame dance and felt something tender unfold inside him, the beginning of understanding. The older cook cleared his throat. "If you don't mind, may I ask you something?" he said. The old woman looked up. "Of course." "Why did you leave?" he asked, almost ashamed of the question. She stirred her soup slowly. "My husband got sick," she said. "We didn't have the money for treatment. I sold the restaurant to someone who promised to keep the doors open for the people who needed it." Her eyes drifted toward the wall of photographs. "I suppose promises change." The boy's hand tightened around his spoon. "You gave them everything," he whispered. She touched his cheek gently. "I gave what I could. Life gives and takes in its own ways." The cook lowered his head, his throat tightening around words he wasn't sure he could speak. At the bar, a young server whispered to another, "She used to feed my uncle when he was homeless. I swear my mom told me about her." Another guest murmured, "My dad says she gave him bread when he had nothing." Whispers this time didn't sting. They softened. They healed. They grew. The manager approached again, this time slower, more grounded. He carried a black box in his hands, one that hadn't been opened in years. He stopped in front of her and placed it gently on the table. "This belonged to the original owner," he said quietly. "It was kept in our archives. We never knew who should have it." The old woman looked at the box with curiosity and caution. Her fingers hovered near the lid before she opened it. Inside lay a brass key, old, scratched, heavy with memory. The boy gasped. "Is that—" She nodded slowly. "The original front door key." Her fingertips touched the metal. The warmth of the restaurant lights reflected off its worn surface, giving it a soft golden sheen. The manager cleared his throat. "It's yours," he said. "Always was." A quiet overcame the entire room. Conversations dimmed to a hush, glasses lowered, forks paused. It was as if every person in the restaurant had suddenly remembered they were in the presence of someone whose story mattered more than their reservations or their wine pairings. The boy looked around, stunned by the shift. The same eyes that had judged them now watched with reverence. The same people who whispered cruelly now whispered in awe. The old woman closed her hand around the key, exhaling shakily. Without being asked, the manager continued. "There's more," he admitted. "We have a tradition here. Every founder, every person who built something worth passing on has their name placed in the Hall of Legacy." He swallowed. "Your name belongs there, and it never should have been removed." The old woman blinked once, twice. I never asked to be remembered." The manager lowered his head. "But you were, and you still are. Tonight proved that." He pressed a hand gently against his heart. "Please, let us honor you properly." The boy lifted his gaze, the truth finally settling. This place was hers. Every brick, every recipe, every warm plate that ever crossed the table here carried a fragment of her kindness. She took a long breath, steady and fragile all at once. "If you wish to honor me," she said quietly, "then feed the hungry again. That's all I ever wanted." The manager froze, the simplicity of her request striking deeper than any demand for recognition could. "I will," he said softly without hesitation. "We will." The boy felt something expand inside his chest, something too big for words. The candle flickered higher, as if lifting its small flame toward her. The truth had risen. And the night was preparing the room for the moment none of them would forget. The moment when her identity would no longer be a quiet secret in the corner. The reveal was coming. And this time, the whole world would see. The manager stepped back, giving the old woman a moment with the key resting in her palm. The glow from the candle flickered against its brass surface, casting a soft halo around her fingers. The room had quieted into a reverent stillness, the kind that feels like the air itself is waiting. The boy sat straighter, watching his grandmother as though seeing her for the first time. She didn't look different, but something around her did, as if the truth inside her had finally found enough room to breathe. The older cook returned to the kitchen, and within moments an aroma drifted through the air. Warm bread just pulled from the oven. It wasn't on the menu. It wasn't part of the evening service, but it was the bread she used to make. He had followed the recipe by memory, by story, by instinct. When it arrived at the table, wrapped in a linen cloth, the boy leaned in and smiled, before taking even a bite. He could feel the comfort in it, and the history. The old woman broke off a small piece, closed her eyes as it touched her tongue, and nodded once, a gesture of quiet approval. The cook's shoulders relaxed, his tension melting into relief. A murmur spread through the dining room, but this time it wasn't laughter or judgment. It was recognition, soft, hesitant, building like a rising tide. A woman at a nearby table stood, hesitating only a second before approaching. Her voice trembled. "Excuse me. I don't want to intrude, but my mother used to bring me here when I was a child. She told me about a woman who gave her food once when she had nothing. She said that woman saved her." The old woman looked up, surprised. The guest continued, her voice cracking. "She said the food tasted like safety." She pressed her hand to her chest. "I never knew who she meant, not until now." The boy looked between them, his heart blooming with something deep and fierce. The guest bowed her head in respect and returned to her table, dabbing her eyes with her napkin. More movement. A man from the bar approached next. He looked older, weary, his hands calloused. A man whose life had not been gentle with him. "I owe you a thank you," he said quietly. "You once gave me a bowl of stew when I'd lost everything. You didn't ask my name. You didn't ask anything." He swallowed hard. "I got back on my feet because of that moment." The old woman blinked slowly. She didn't remember each story. Too many years, too many faces. But the gratitude in their eyes filled something inside her she hadn't realized was empty. The boy touched her arm, overwhelmed. He couldn't hold the tears gathering in his eyes. "Grandma, you helped all these people?" She didn't answer with words. She simply cupped his cheek gently, her thumb brushing away the tear that escaped. Her silence spoke the loudest truth. Kindness had been her life's language long before he was born. Another plate arrived, this one carried by the manager himself. "For you," he said softly. "Your dish, exactly as it used to be served, only the bowl is new." He set it down. A simple stew, presented without decoration, without flourish. The boy looked at it like it was a treasure. The old woman lowered her head in gratitude. When she took her first bite, a pause settled over the room. She tasted not just the broth, but the years behind it. The mornings she woke before dawn to stir the pot, the nights she stayed late to feed the last person who came through the door. She tasted the life she had built and the one she had let go of. A breath trembled out of her chest, and the boy leaned in, holding her hand under the table. The lights in the restaurant dimmed slowly, intentionally, until a soft golden glow lingered over only one table, hers. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't extravagant. It was reverent. Guests watched with quiet awe. Some placed their hands over their hearts without realizing it. Others lowered their eyes, humbled. A few wiped tears they didn't expect. The atmosphere transformed into something sacred, like a chapel rebuilt inside a dining room. One of the servers, the youngest in the staff, approached timidly. She held a stack of menus in her hands, but not the ones used tonight. These were older, their edges frayed, their pages printed in simple black ink. "We found these in the storage room," she whispered, offering one to the old woman. "The first menu, from your days." The boy leaned closer. The dishes were simple. Stew, bread, coffee, beans, soup. Prices barely more than pennies. At the bottom of the menu was a line handwritten in delicate script. "No one leaves hungry." He inhaled sharply. "Grandma, that's yours?" She nodded slowly, her eyes shining. "Your grandfather wrote it," she said, "but it was our rule." The boy traced the words with his fingertip, as though touching a part of his own inheritance. Something warm spread through his chest, a sense of belonging that felt ancient and new all at once. Guests continued approaching, one after another, a teacher, a retired nurse, a young man in a business suit. Each with a small story, a moment, a memory of kindness they didn't realize came from the same woman sitting quietly at the back table. The boy's jaw tightened with emotion. He leaned close, his voice trembling as he whispered, "Why did they forget you?" She smiled gently. People don't always remember the hands that build the foundation, she said. They just live inside the house. His heart ached, but they should have remembered. She brushed her thumb across his cheek. You remembered, she whispered. That's enough for me. The boy swallowed hard, his throat thick with pride and sorrow mixed together. She didn't see herself the way he saw her. To him, she was the strongest person he knew. To others, she had been invisible. Until now. The manager stepped forward again, this time with a microphone in his hand. He didn't look confident. He didn't look authoritative. He looked humbled, changed, carrying the weight of understanding. I'd like to say something, he said, his voice resonating across the dining room. The room fell silent, every face turning toward the corner. The old woman stiffened. She wasn't used to being looked at this way. The boy squeezed her hand under the table. The manager continued. Tonight we learned that the woman seated before us is not simply a guest. She is the founder of this place, the heart of its beginning, the hands that built what we have, and we forgot her. A hush fell deeper than silence. We failed her tonight, he said, voice cracking. But we have the chance to do what should have been done long ago. He gestured subtly toward the staff, the older cook, the servers, the hostess. They all stepped closer, forming a quiet half circle around her table, not enclosing her, but honoring her. She built this place on compassion, the manager said, on the belief that every person deserves a warm meal and dignity. His voice trembled. And we swear to bring that spirit back. A soft ripple of applause began, hesitant at first, then growing, then swelling until it filled the entire room. Not thunderous, not loud, but warm, sincere. A gratitude that wrapped itself around her like a long-delayed embrace. The old woman bowed her head, overwhelmed. The boy pressed his forehead to her shoulder, whispering, "They finally see you, Grandma." And they did. The entire room stood, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but out of respect. The boy looked around with wide eyes, watching strangers honor the woman he loved most in the world. Their applause washed over her, soft and steady, like rain falling on dry ground. She lifted her head slowly, and the candle between them flickered higher, as if answering her breath. The truth was no longer hidden. Her legacy was no longer silent, and the night was opening itself for the final, most tender reveal, the moment when her grandson would understand not just who she had been, but who he was becoming because of her. Morning came with a pale blue sky and a thin mist resting over the sidewalk. The kind that softens the world and makes every sound feel hushed. The restaurant's neon sign flickered quietly in the early light, not yet awake for the day. A light breeze carried the faint smell of bread drifting from the back kitchen, the same scent that once defined the place before it changed hands, before her name faded from its walls. She stood outside with her grandson, his hand wrapped around hers the way it had been the night before. The candle from their table had burned down to a small pool of wax, now cooled and tucked safely inside her coat pocket. And the key, the brass key she once carried every day, rested in her other hand. She held it gently, not as a claim, not as a possession, but as a reminder of something she thought she had lost forever. The boy looked up at her, searching her face. She seemed different in the morning light, softer somehow, but also steadier, as if something that had been closed for years had finally opened inside her. He didn't speak right away. He knew she was listening to the quiet, listening to the ghosts of footsteps she once knew, listening to the memories that now felt less like scars and more like windows she could finally look through without pain. Inside, The staff moved slowly, preparing for the day. The manager walked with a different posture now, shoulders no longer stiff but humbled. The older cook hummed softly, a tune she recognized from decades ago, something her husband used to whistle when stirring the morning stew. A young server placed bowls on the counter with a care she hadn't shown before, glancing toward the window as if hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had changed the tone of the place overnight. The boy tugged gently at her sleeve. "Grandma?" he whispered. "Are you okay?" She nodded, the smile faint, but true. "I'm more than okay." He didn't know what that meant, not fully, but he felt it. He felt the quiet strength in her hand. He felt the warmth in her eyes. He felt the steadiness in her breath, a steadiness he hadn't seen in a long time. A car passed slowly on the street, tires whispering over the pavement. A woman walking her dog paused when she recognized the old woman and offered a small nod, one filled with silent respect. A jogger slowed his pace, dipping his head when he saw the key in her hand. News had spread, not like gossip, not like rumor, but like gratitude traveling from one heart to another. She squeezed the boy's fingers. "Let's go in," she said softly. When the door opened, the bell chimed again, the same delicate sound from the night before. But this time, the room didn't fall silent out of judgment. It breathed in as though greeting someone returning home after a long, difficult journey. Every staff member lifted their gaze. The young hostess stepped forward with a small bouquet of wildflowers, simple and uneven, wrapped in paper torn from the back of the old menu. She held them out with trembling hands. "For you," she whispered. "From all of us." The old woman accepted the flowers, her thumb brushing the fragile stems. She inhaled their scent. Fresh, green, honest. The boy stood a little straighter, pride warming his cheeks. A small smile tugged at his mouth. The cook emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. "I made your stew again," he said gently. "I hope that's all right." She nodded. It was more than all right. As the bowl arrived, steam curling upward like soft white threads, she rested the key beside it. Her grandson looked at the key, then at her, uncertain. "Are you taking it back?" he asked. She considered her answer. The room waited with her. "No," she said finally. "I'm giving it forward." The manager's eyes shone. "We'd be honored." She smiled, placing her hand over the key. "This place doesn't belong to me anymore," she said. "It belongs to everyone who walks through that door. It belongs to kindness." The boy stared at her, something shifting inside him, something growing roots. He had spent his whole life admiring her without fully understanding why. Now he knew. Kindness wasn't just something she offered. It was something she planted. And last night, he had watched it bloom. He reached out and touched the key with her. "Can I stay beside you for a moment?" he asked quietly. "Just like I did last night." She smiled, brushing a curl from his forehead. "You always can." They sat together in a small corner booth, the morning sun spilling across the table like warm honey. The bowl of stew glowed beneath the light. The flowers rested between them. The key lay still, no longer heavy, but anchored in meaning rather than memory. Customers trickled in. A few recognized her and approached with quiet gratitude, sharing small stories. A meal she once gave, a kindness she once offered, a moment she once saved without knowing. She listened with tenderness, sometimes touching the boy's arm, sometimes letting her fingers rest lightly on the old menu they'd placed beside her. He watched her, feeling his chest fill with a warmth he hadn't known how to name. He leaned close, whispering, "I'm glad they know now." She placed her hand over his. "The world forgets sometimes," she said, "but love remembers. It always remembers." The boy closed his eyes for a second, letting her words sink in. The restaurant hummed around them, soft clinks of silverware, the sizzle of onions in the kitchen, the murmur of voices softened by morning light. It felt different now. It felt honest. It felt whole. One final moment brought everything together. A young mother entered with her daughter, a little girl with a red ribbon in her hair. They sat near the window. The girl dropped her napkin and looked frightened to pick it up, as though she didn't want to disturb anything. Before her mother could react, the boy stood, walked gently to the table, picked it up, and placed it back in front of her with a kind smile. "It's okay," he said softly. "You belong here." The old woman watched him return to her side, her heart swelling. She saw her legacy reflected in his eyes: gentleness, courage, compassion. He was the one carrying it forward now. Softly, she reached for his hand again. "Because when the world turned away," she whispered, "you stayed." He rested his head on her shoulder, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it was meant to be. A life returned to itself. A truth finally spoken, a boy growing into the kind of person she had always hoped he would become. Outside, the sun climbed a little higher. Inside, she closed her eyes and breathed in the warmth, letting the morning wrap itself around her. When she opened them again, gratitude filled the room like sunlight through a window. Because when the world turned away, love remained. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need to remember that kindness still heals wounds time alone cannot. And if you'd like to hear more stories that bring light back into the quiet corners of the heart, feel free to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapter we unfold here. Another story is already waiting for you, right there on your screen, ready to bring a little more hope into your day.